At the family reunion, I discovered my photo had been removed from every family frame. I stood there smiling, pretending not to notice. 3 hours later, I learned it wasn't a mistake. It was a message. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. Family reunions had always been my favorite tradition. For more than 40 years, they were the one thing I could count on. No matter how busy life became, no matter how far relatives moved, every summer we gathered together. Children ran through backyards. Uncles argued over barbecue recipes. Aunts brought enough food to feed an army. And photographs captured everything. At 70 years old, photographs meant more to me than they once had. They weren't just pictures anymore. They were proof. Proof that we had laughed together. Proof that we had survived hard times. Proof that people who are gone were once standing right beside us. That was why I spent nearly an hour choosing what to wear that Saturday morning. I finally settled on a soft blue blouse that my late husband, Milton, had always loved. "You look beautiful in blue," he used to tell me. Even after all these years, I could still hear his voice. I stood in front of the mirror and adjusted the silver pendant around my neck. Inside, it was a tiny photograph of Milton, a habit I'd never abandoned after losing him 4 years earlier. The house felt quiet as I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. For a moment, I looked around my living room. Photographs covered nearly every wall. Wedding pictures, graduation pictures, family vacations, Christmas mornings, a lifetime preserved in wooden frames. I smiled. Then I locked the door behind me. The reunion was being held at my son Preston's house this year. His property sat on 5 acres outside town, with a large backyard perfect for gatherings. As I drove down the familiar country road, I found myself feeling excited. That surprised me. Lately, family events had become complicated. Not openly, not dramatically. Just small things, subtle things. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Forgotten invitations. Decisions made without asking my opinion. Nothing big enough to confront, but enough to notice. I had tried convincing myself I was imagining it. After all, people get busy. Children grow up. Families change. That was normal, wasn't it? When I arrived, cars already filled the driveway. Music drifted through the open backyard. I could hear laughter before I even stepped out of my car. For a moment, warmth spread through my chest. This was what family was supposed to feel like. I grabbed the peach cobbler I'd baked that morning and walked toward the house. My granddaughter Delaney spotted me first. "Grandma." She rushed across the lawn and wrapped her arms around me. I laughed. "Careful, sweetheart. These old bones aren't as sturdy as they used to be." "You say that every year," she replied. "And every year you're still stronger than everyone else." I kissed her cheek. For the first time that day, I felt completely at ease. The afternoon unfolded exactly as I had hoped. Children played tag, relatives shared stories, people complimented my cobbler. Even Yvonne, my daughter-in-law, greeted me with unusual enthusiasm. "Clarice, you look wonderful," she said. Her smile was flawless, almost too flawless. Still, I pushed the thought aside. I didn't come here looking for problems. I came here looking for family. About an hour later, I stepped inside the house to use the restroom. The cool air conditioning was a welcome escape from the summer heat. As I walked through the hallway, I noticed something different. Preston had recently remodeled part of the house. Fresh paint, new lighting, new furniture. Everything looked polished, carefully arranged, almost like a model home. Then I reached the family room and stopped. An entire wall was covered in photographs. Large frames, small frames. Generations of family history. At first, I smiled. I moved closer to admire them. There was Preston's college graduation, Delaney's first birthday, Brody holding a fishing trophy, holiday gatherings, anniversary celebrations, hundreds of memories. Then my smile faded, slowly, almost imperceptibly, because something wasn't right. I stepped closer. My eyes scanned the photographs again. Then again. My stomach tightened. I looked at the largest frame on the wall, a family portrait, taken 10 years earlier. Everyone was there. Preston, Yvonne, the children, several relatives. But not me. That was strange. I remembered standing in that photograph. I remembered exactly where I had been standing, right beside Milton. I frowned. Maybe they had displayed a different version. I moved to another frame, then another, then another. Each time, the same thing happened. I wasn't there. The vacation photo from Colorado, gone. The Christmas portrait, gone. The reunion picture from years ago, gone. One by one, I realized every image containing me had either disappeared or been replaced. The wall showed the history of our family, a history that no longer included me. I stood completely still. The sounds of laughter from outside drifted faintly through the windows, but suddenly they felt far away. My reflection stared back at me from the glass of a frame, an old woman standing alone in a room full of memories. Memories she could have sworn belonged to her. I felt a strange ache settle deep in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, something quieter. I reached toward one frame and touched the edge of the glass. Someone had done this deliberately. The question was why, and as I stood there staring at a wall that seemed determined to erase me from my own family story, I had no idea that before the day ended, I would discover the answer. I stood there for another few seconds, staring at that wall of photographs. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy, because after 70 years of life, I'd learned something important. The person who loses control first usually loses everything else shortly afterward. So I straightened my shoulders, adjusted the pendant around my neck, and walked back outside as if nothing had happened. The reunion continued around me. Children ran through the grass. Someone turned up the country music playing from the patio speakers. The smell of grilled burgers drifted through the warm afternoon air. On the surface, everything looked perfect. But suddenly I felt like a stranger observing someone else's family. I carried that feeling quietly. No one noticed. Or perhaps they did and chose not to say anything. As I crossed the backyard, I caught sight of Preston, standing near the grill, talking with two cousins. My son laughed at something one of them said. For a moment, I simply watched him. 46 years old, tall like his father, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin. When he was little, he used to follow me everywhere. If I planted flowers, he planted flowers. If I baked cookies, he wanted to help. If I sat on the porch, he'd drag a chair beside mine. Back then, I couldn't imagine a world where we wouldn't be close. Life has a way of changing things, not all at once, little by little, conversation by conversation, year by year, until one day you wake up and realize the distance between two people has become an ocean. Mom. His voice pulled me back to the present. I looked up. He was smiling. You okay? Of course. I smiled back. Why wouldn't I be? He nodded. For a brief second, something flickered across his face, almost like uncertainty. Then it disappeared. The moment passed. A few relatives joined us, and the conversation moved on. I said all the right things, laughed at the appropriate moments, complimented the food, asked about jobs, grandchildren, vacations. The entire time, my mind kept drifting back to that wall, to those missing photographs, to the impossible feeling that someone had carefully erased me. An hour later, people gathered beneath a large white tent set up near the back fence. Tables had been arranged in long rows, covered with blue and white tablecloths. Family recipes filled every available inch of space. Potato salad, baked beans, cornbread, fried chicken, peach cobbler, the kind of meal that had defined our reunions for decades. I found a seat near the middle. Across from me sat my granddaughter Delaney. Beside her was her younger brother Brody. The two of them had always been the brightest part of these gatherings for me. At 22, Delaney was finishing graduate school. Smart, kind, observant, the kind of young woman who noticed things most people missed. Brody was 17, still growing into himself, still innocent enough to speak before thinking. That innocence would become important later. At the time, I didn't know it. We ate and talked. The conversation drifted from family stories to sports to vacation plans. Then Brody spoke up. Mom spent weeks fixing the photo wall. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth, only for a second. Then I continued eating. Across the table, Yvonne smiled. Oh, it needed updating. Several relatives nodded politely. Brody shrugged. I thought the old version looked better. Yvonne's smile tightened slightly. Well, not everyone agrees. The conversation moved on, but my attention remained fixed. Updating. Such a harmless word. People update furniture. People update paint colors. People update landscaping. Apparently, People could update family history too. I took a sip of iced tea, said nothing. The afternoon sunlight began to soften as the hours passed. More relatives arrived. More photographs were taken. I noticed something strange. Every time someone suggested a family picture, Yvonne somehow managed the arrangement. She directed people where to stand, adjusted positions, moved chairs, organized everything. At first it seemed harmless. Then I noticed something else. Twice, she positioned me at the very edge of the group. The third time, she didn't call me over at all. Maybe no one else noticed. I did. Years ago, I would have questioned it. Now I simply watched. Watching tells you far more than speaking. Near sunset, I stepped away from the crowd for a few minutes. The noise of the reunion faded behind me. A gentle breeze moved through the trees at the edge of the property. I found myself thinking about Milton. He loved family reunions. Every year he carried a camera around his neck. He photographed everything: the children, the grandparents, the dogs running through the yard, even the food. Sometimes I'd tease him about taking too many pictures. He always gave the same answer: one day these moments will matter more than we realize. Standing there alone, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Photographs weren't about the past. They were about belonging. They were proof that you existed in someone's story, and somebody had just tried to remove me from ours. The realization settled heavily inside me, not because of vanity, not because I needed my face hanging on a wall, but because of what it represented. You don't remove one photograph by accident. You don't remove 20 by accident. And you certainly don't remove every photograph of one person by accident. That takes effort, planning, intention. As I turned back toward the house, I noticed Delaney standing on the patio watching me. When our eyes met, she immediately looked away, almost as if she'd been debating whether to say something. That caught my attention. Delaney wasn't the type to hide her thoughts. A few minutes later, she approached quietly. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart." She glanced toward the house, then toward her mother, then back at me. Her expression looked troubled, like someone carrying a secret that had become too heavy. "Can we talk later?" she asked softly. A small chill ran through me. I smiled anyway. "Of course." Delaney nodded. Then she walked away. I watched her disappear into the crowd. And for the first time that day, I became certain of one thing. The missing photographs were only the beginning. Someone in this family knew exactly what had happened. And before the reunion was over, the truth was finally going to start coming out. Delaney's words stayed with me for the rest of the evening. "Can we talk later?" Such a simple sentence. Yet there had been something in her voice that I couldn't ignore. Concern, hesitation, maybe even guilt. The reunion carried on around me, but my attention drifted elsewhere. People laughed. Children chased each other across the lawn. Music played softly from the speakers near the patio. From a distance, it looked like the perfect family gathering. The kind of day people post on social media with captions about love and togetherness. But I had lived long enough to know appearances could be deceiving. Sometimes the happiest photographs hide the saddest truths. As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and orange, relatives began gathering near the outdoor fire pit. The evening portion of the reunion was always my favorite. People slowed down, conversations became more personal, stories from years ago resurfaced. For decades, this had been the time when family history came alive. Milton used to sit beside the fire and tell stories from our early years together. Everyone loved listening to him, even the grandchildren who pretended not to. I found myself missing him more than usual that evening. Maybe because I felt so alone. Maybe because if he had been there, none of this would have happened. Or maybe because I was beginning to realize how much protection his presence had provided. Without him, something fundamental had shifted inside the family. I sat quietly near the edge of the gathering. Nobody was rude. Nobody was openly hostile. In some ways, that made everything worse. People smiled. People chatted. People included me just enough to avoid looking guilty. The exclusion wasn't obvious. It was subtle, carefully measured, almost professional. As darkness settled over the property, I noticed Yvonne moving through the crowd. She seemed unusually busy, checking decorations, talking to relatives, organizing things that didn't appear to need organizing. Everywhere she went, people listened. Years ago, she had entered this family as an outsider. Now she seemed determined to position herself at its center. I watched her from across the yard. The strange thing was that she never looked directly at me. Not once. Whenever our paths should have crossed, she found a reason to turn away. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit, because avoidance often says more than confrontation. A little later, I finally found the opportunity to speak with Delaney. She was standing alone near the back porch, looking down at her phone. The moment she saw me approaching, she slipped the phone into her pocket. "Grandma," I smiled. "There you are." For a second she looked nervous. Not nervous like a young woman in trouble, nervous like someone carrying information they weren't sure how to share. I leaned against the porch railing. "You wanted to talk." She glanced toward the backyard, making sure nobody was close enough to overhear. That immediately caught my attention. When people check who's listening, the conversation is rarely a pleasant one. "Grandma," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did you notice the photo wall?" There it was. The question I'd been expecting. I held her gaze. "Yes." Her shoulders dropped slightly, almost as if she was relieved she no longer had to pretend. "You noticed too." I nodded. I noticed. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The sounds of laughter drifted across the yard. Someone tossed another log onto the fire. A burst of sparks floated upward into the darkening sky. Delaney lowered her voice even further. I thought it was strange. I waited. When Mom started changing the photographs, a cold feeling settled in my stomach. Not because of what she said, because of how naturally she said it. As though this hadn't happened yesterday. As though it had been going on for some time. "Changing them?" I asked carefully. Delaney nodded. "A few weeks ago." A few weeks. That meant planning. Time. Deliberation. This wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a project. What exactly did she change? Delaney hesitated. "I don't know everything." The answer sounded honest. But I remember seeing boxes of old frames in the garage. My heartbeat quickened slightly. I asked her about them, and she said she was updating family memories. The same word Brody had used earlier. Updating. Again. Almost like everyone had been given the same explanation. Delaney looked uncomfortable. At first, I didn't think much about it. "Why would you?" She stared toward the house. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. Later, I realized most of the pictures she removed had one thing in common. I already knew the answer. Still, hearing someone else say it felt different. They all had you in them. The words landed quietly, yet somehow they echoed inside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I looked out across the yard, at my family, at people I'd loved my entire life. People I'd supported, celebrated, protected. People whose birthdays I remembered, whose graduations I attended, whose children I held when they were babies. And now I was learning that someone had systematically removed me from the visual history of that family. Not one picture, not two, all of them. Delaney's eyes softened. "I'm sorry, Grandma." I forced a smile. "None of this is your fault." "No." Her expression darkened. "But I don't think it's an accident either." Neither did I. Not anymore. The last pieces of doubt were disappearing. Something intentional had happened here. Something bigger than hurt feelings. Something bigger than redecorating. Because people don't erase someone from photographs unless they're trying to erase something else too. A memory, a role, a legacy. Just then, movement near the patio caught my eye. Yvonne had stepped outside. For the first time all evening, our eyes met. Only for a second. But it was enough. Something flashed across her face. Not surprise, not guilt. Recognition, as if she suddenly realized I knew. Then she quickly looked away. My pulse slowed. Oddly enough, I felt calmer than before. Because uncertainty had finally been replaced by certainty. The photographs hadn't disappeared by accident. Someone wanted me removed from the family's story. And for the first time, I was beginning to understand exactly who that someone was. What I didn't know yet was why. But I had a feeling that answer was coming soon. And when it did, it would change the way I saw my family forever. I couldn't stop thinking about those photographs. Not that night. Not while relatives laughed around the fire pit. Not while children roasted marshmallows and chased each other across the yard. And certainly not while Yvonne moved through the crowd acting as though nothing had happened. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Because those pictures weren't random decorations. They were pieces of a family's history. Pieces of my history. Every photograph on that wall represented a moment I remembered. A moment I had lived. A moment I had helped create. As I sat quietly beneath the string lights hanging across Preston's backyard, Memories began surfacing one after another. The first photograph I remembered was from 30 years ago. Preston had just graduated from college. Milton and I were standing on either side of him. He wore a navy cap and gown. I remember crying before the ceremony even started. Milton teased me for weeks afterward. He's graduating, Clarice, not moving to Mars. But I couldn't help it. I was proud. Proud of the young man he'd become. Proud of the sacrifices that had helped him get there. Back then, money was tight. Very tight. Milton's construction business was still small. Some winters were difficult. There were months when every dollar mattered. I worked extra hours tutoring students after school. Milton worked weekends. We rarely complained, because everything we did had a purpose, a future, a dream. Preston's future. I remember one particular winter when our furnace failed. The repair bill was expensive, far more expensive than we could comfortably afford. That same week, Preston's tuition payment was due. Milton and I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight discussing our options. The next morning we paid the tuition and spent the rest of the winter using portable heaters. At the time, it felt worth it, because that's what parents do. You give, you sacrifice, you put your children first. The second photograph that came to mind showed a much younger Yvonne. She had only been dating Preston for a few months. We invited her to Thanksgiving dinner. She seemed shy back then, quiet, nervous. Nothing like the confident woman she had become. I remembered helping her in the kitchen, showing her how Milton liked his mashed potatoes, listening to stories about her childhood, trying my best to make her feel welcome. When Preston eventually proposed, I was genuinely happy. I wanted him to find someone who loved him, someone who would build a life with him, someone who would become family. And for a long time, I believed she had. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive wearing a warning sign. It grows slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Looking back now, I could see moments I had ignored, moments that felt insignificant at the time. The first Christmas after Preston and Yvonne were married. She insisted on hosting. I thought that was wonderful. Young couples should create their own traditions. But afterward, I noticed something. Most of the family photographs she posted online featured everyone except me. At the time, I laughed it off. There were dozens of pictures. Surely it wasn't intentional. Then there was Delaney's 10th birthday party. I remembered standing beside the birthday cake, helping pass out gifts. Later, when the photos appeared online, I was nowhere to be found. Again, I ignored it, because who keeps score of things like that? At least that's what I told myself. Now, sitting at the reunion years later, those memories felt different, connected, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. A pattern was emerging, and once you see a pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. I glanced toward the house. Through the windows, I could still see portions of that photo wall, the carefully arranged frames, the carefully edited history, a history where I had slowly disappeared. My eyes drifted toward Yvonne again. She was speaking with a group of relatives near the patio, laughing, smiling, perfectly composed, the image of a devoted wife and mother. Several people around her seemed completely charmed. Maybe that was part of what made this so effective. Nobody suspects the person who always appears pleasant. Nobody questions someone who knows exactly how to manage appearances. Milton used to say something similar. Character isn't revealed when people are watching, Clarice. It's revealed when they think nobody will notice. I suddenly wished he were sitting beside me. He always saw things I missed, always understood people better than I did. For 43 years, he had been the person I trusted most, the person who balanced my tendency to see the best in everyone. Without him, I had spent years convincing myself that every uncomfortable feeling was simply grief, that every growing distance within the family was normal, that every exclusion was accidental. Maybe I wanted to believe that, because the alternative hurt too much. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. Several cousins had started sharing old family stories around the fire. One by one, people joined in. The stories all had something in common. They involved memories, shared experiences, family history, and as I listened, a realization slowly settled over me. Photographs weren't really the issue. The frames weren't the issue. The wall wasn't the issue. Those were only symptoms. The real issue was much deeper. Someone wasn't trying to remove my image. Someone was trying to remove my importance, trying to rewrite the story of this family, trying to convince everyone that the foundation had been built by someone else. That thought should have made me angry. Instead, it made me sad. Because history doesn't disappear when you hide the evidence. Truth doesn't vanish because someone rearranges a few photographs. The people who lived those moments still remember them. The sacrifices still happened. The love still existed. No frame on a wall could change that. Yet as I sat there under the glow of the string lights, watching my family laugh and talk, a quiet voice inside me whispered something I could no longer ignore. This wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the result of years of something I had failed to see. And somewhere in this family, someone knew exactly how long it had been happening. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People gathered around the fire pit. Children carried blankets across the lawn. Someone brought out desserts. Someone else started playing old country songs from a portable speaker. The reunion looked exactly the way it always had. Warm, comfortable, familiar. Yet something had changed. Or perhaps something had been changing for years, and I was only now seeing it clearly. I stayed longer than I usually would have. Part of me wanted to leave, to drive home, to sit quietly in my living room and sort through everything I'd learned. But another part of me knew I needed to stay. When something feels wrong, leaving too early often means missing the truth. Around 9 o'clock, many of the older relatives began saying their goodbyes. Cars slowly disappeared from the driveway. The crowd became smaller. The noise softened. I was helping collect paper plates when I felt a light touch on my arm. I turned. It was Delaney. "Grandma, do you have a minute?" I nodded. "Of course." She glanced toward the house, not toward her parents, toward the side yard beyond the patio, the quietest area on the property. I followed her there without asking questions. The moment we were alone, I noticed how tense she looked. Her arms were crossed tightly. Her jaw was set. For a few seconds she simply stared at the grass. Then she finally spoke. "I don't think you know everything." The statement didn't surprise me. In fact, I had been expecting it. "What don't I know?" I asked gently. Delaney exhaled slowly. "A lot of people noticed the pictures." That caught my attention. "A lot?" She nodded. "Not everyone said anything, but people noticed." I thought about that. Part of me had assumed the missing photographs were something only I would recognize. Apparently I was wrong. When did they notice? After Mom changed the wall. A knot tightened inside my chest. The fact that relatives had noticed meant the changes were obvious, which meant nobody could honestly claim it was an accident. Delaney looked toward the house again. The lights from the windows illuminated the backyard. Inside, I could see silhouettes moving through the rooms. Family members. My family, or at least the people I had always considered family. "I overheard something a few weeks ago," she said quietly. I waited. I wasn't supposed to hear it. My pulse quickened. She lowered her voice. Mom was talking to Aunt Patricia. Patricia, Milton's younger sister, one of the few people in the family who had never been afraid to speak her mind. "What did she say?" Delaney hesitated. Then she repeated the words exactly. She said the family needed a fresh start. Fresh start. There was that phrase again, different words. Same idea. Updating. Fresh start. Moving forward. All of them sounded harmless. Until you looked at what was actually being removed. Me. What else? I asked. Delaney swallowed. Patricia asked why you weren't in the new displays. I felt my heart sink slightly. And? Mom said some people hold the family back because they refuse to let go of the past. The words hung between us. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Cruel. I stared into the darkness for several seconds. Not because I was shocked. Because I was trying to understand. For years I had supported that family. For years I had celebrated their milestones. Helped with babysitting. Hosted holidays. Paid for things when money was tight. Opened my home whenever someone needed help. And somehow I had become someone who was holding the family back. The thought hurt more than I wanted to admit. Delaney stepped closer. Grandma, I didn't believe her. I looked at her. Her eyes were sincere. I know. Neither did Aunt Patricia. That surprised me. What happened? Delaney gave a small, sad smile. They argued. Now that sounded like Patricia. Mom thought nobody could hear them. A strange feeling of relief washed over me. Not relief because there had been an argument. Relief because someone had spoken up. Someone had noticed. Someone had questioned it. For the first time all day, I felt slightly less alone. Aunt Patricia said Grandpa Milton would never have allowed this. My throat tightened. Milton. Even now, years after his passing, People still remembered the standards he had set, the values he had protected. Family mattered to him. Not appearances, not control, not image. Family. Delaney continued. Mom got angry when Patricia said that. I wasn't surprised. People rarely enjoy being compared to someone whose character exposes their own shortcomings. What happened after that? They stopped talking. The answer was simple, but it explained a lot. I suddenly remembered noticing that Patricia had been unusually distant from Yvonne during the reunion. At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. Now it made sense. The disagreement had started weeks ago, long before I walked into that family room and discovered the missing photographs. Long before I understood what was happening. The more pieces I gathered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't about decorating. It wasn't about organizing. And it certainly wasn't about updating a photo wall. This was about influence, about control, about deciding who mattered in the story of this family. Delaney reached for my hand, a gesture she hadn't made since she was a little girl. I'm sorry, Grandma. I squeezed her hand gently. You have nothing to apologize for, but I should have told you sooner. No, I smiled softly. You told me when you were ready. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The night air felt cooler now. The reunion was winding down. Inside the house, lights glowed behind the windows. And suddenly I realized something important. The missing photographs had revealed more than Yvonne ever intended. They had exposed who was willing to stay silent, who was willing to question things, and who still remembered the truth. As Delaney and I walked back toward the house, I noticed someone standing near the kitchen window, watching us. Patricia. The moment our eyes met, she gave me a small nod. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a quiet acknowledgement, a signal, the kind that says, you're not imagining this. And for the first time since arriving at the reunion, I knew I wasn't facing this alone. Patricia's nod stayed with me, long after the conversation ended. It wasn't dramatic. She hadn't marched across the yard and announced that I was being treated unfairly. She hadn't confronted Yvonne. She hadn't created a scene. But somehow that small gesture meant more than any speech could have. Because for the first time that day, someone had silently confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't imagining any of it. As the reunion began winding down, relatives slowly gathered their belongings. Children who had spent the afternoon running through the yard now looked exhausted. Folding chairs disappeared. Food containers were packed away. The familiar rhythm of ending settled over the property. Usually this part of the evening made me a little sad. Family reunions only happened once a year. Nobody knew how many more we'd have. At 70, you become aware of those things. You start counting moments differently. But that night, I wasn't thinking about endings. I was thinking about questions. Questions that refused to leave me alone. Why now? Why remove the photographs now? Why after all these years? And most importantly, why did Yvonne seem so determined to push me out of the family's story? I was loading empty serving dishes into my car when Patricia finally approached. She glanced around briefly before speaking. Not because she was afraid. Patricia had never been afraid of anyone. It was more that she understood some conversations required privacy. You staying a few more minutes? She asked. I can. She nodded. Good. That single word told me everything. There was something she wanted to discuss. A few minutes later, we found ourselves sitting on a wooden bench near the edge of the property. The sounds of cleanup continued in the distance, but nobody was close enough to overhear us. Patricia folded her hands in her lap. For several seconds she stared toward the house. Then she sighed. I was wondering how long it would take. I looked at her. For what? For you to notice. The honesty caught me off guard. Not because it was cruel, because it confirmed this situation had been unfolding for much longer than I'd realized. You knew? Patricia nodded slowly. I knew something wasn't right. I remained silent. She continued. The photographs were only the latest thing. A chill ran through me. Only the latest thing. Not the first. Not the only. The latest. I suddenly remembered all the small moments I'd dismissed over the years. The missing invitations. The altered plans. The family photos posted online without me. The holidays that somehow became smaller whenever I was included, and larger whenever I wasn't. At the time, each incident had seemed insignificant. Taken together, they painted a very different picture. Patricia looked directly at me. Clarice, can I ask you something? Of course. When was the last time you truly felt included in decisions about this family? The question hit harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. Because I honestly didn't know. I thought back. Christmases, birthdays, graduations, vacations, family gatherings. Somewhere along the way, my role had changed. Without anyone formally saying so, without any conversation, without any obvious conflict. I had gradually moved from participant to spectator. The realization hurt. Not because I needed control, because I hadn't even noticed it happening. Patricia seemed to understand exactly what I was thinking. It wasn't sudden, she said quietly. That's why it's dangerous. I stared at the ground. A fallen leaf shifted across the grass in the evening breeze. It happened slowly. Yes. Why? Patricia hesitated. For the first time since we'd sat down, she looked uncertain. Not about what she believed, about how much she should say. Finally, she spoke. I think Yvonne wants to be remembered as the center of the family. The words sounded almost ridiculous, until I considered everything I'd seen. The photo wall, the conversations, the constant need to manage appearances, the way she directed every family photograph, the way she organized every event, the way she positioned herself at the center of every story. Suddenly it didn't sound ridiculous at all. Patricia continued. People like that don't just want influence. I listened carefully. They want ownership. Ownership. The word lingered in my mind. Not ownership of property, ownership of memory, ownership of identity, ownership of history. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Because family history isn't supposed to belong to one person. It's supposed to belong to everyone. Patricia leaned back against the bench. You know what bothered me most? What? Milton. Just hearing his name tightened something inside my chest. What about him? Her expression softened. Half those photographs existed because of him. That was true. Milton had documented everything. Birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, vacations. He carried a camera everywhere. Sometimes it drove the rest of us crazy. Now those photographs were among the family's most valuable possessions. Not financially. Emotionally. Patricia shook her head. He spent decades preserving family memories. She looked toward the house. And now someone is editing them. The sadness in her voice mirrored my own. For a few moments neither of us spoke. The night had grown quiet. Most of the guests had already left. Only a handful remained. Lights glowed from inside the house. Shadows moved behind curtains. A family carrying on with its evening, completely unaware that the foundation beneath it was beginning to crack. Then Patricia said something unexpected. There's something else. I looked up. What? She lowered her voice. A few weeks ago, I saw boxes. Immediately my attention sharpened. What kind of boxes? Storage boxes. A pause. In the garage. My heartbeat quickened. The photographs? Patricia nodded. Some of them. I stared at her, not removed, stored, hidden. That changed everything, because if the pictures still existed, then someone had made a deliberate choice. Not to preserve them, not to display them, but to conceal them. And suddenly I realized this story wasn't really about missing photographs anymore. It was about something much bigger. Someone wasn't trying to throw away the past. Someone was trying to replace it. And as I drove home later that night beneath a sky full of stars, one thought repeated itself over and over in my mind. If Yvonne had hidden the photographs, what else had she been hiding? I barely slept that night. After returning home from the reunion, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at my kitchen table long after midnight. The house was silent. The kind of silence that feels heavier when you're carrying unanswered questions. A lamp glowed softly above the table. The same lamp Milton and I had picked out nearly 20 years earlier. Back then, we spent an entire Saturday arguing over lighting fixtures. Milton wanted practicality. I wanted something beautiful. As usual, we compromised. I smiled at the memory. Then my eyes drifted toward the hallway. Photographs lined the walls there too. Unlike the ones at Preston's house, these hadn't been edited. They hadn't been updated. They hadn't been curated into some polished version of family history. They simply told the truth. I stood and slowly walked down the hallway, one frame at a time. There was Preston at age 8, holding his first baseball glove. There was Delaney as a toddler covered in birthday cake frosting. There was Brody proudly holding a fish nearly bigger than he was. And there was Milton. Everywhere. Smiling. Laughing. Standing beside me. For the first time since the reunion, I felt something stronger than sadness. Determination. Someone had removed me from their wall. Fine. But they couldn't remove me from reality. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The questions Patricia had raised kept echoing through my mind. The photographs were only the latest thing. Someone is editing family memories. The pictures are hidden in storage boxes. I couldn't stop thinking about those boxes. So after breakfast, I drove to the attic storage unit above my garage. Milton had always been organized, painfully organized. Every box was labeled, every album categorized, every photograph preserved. At the time, I used to tease him. Now I was grateful for it. Dust floated through beams of sunlight as I climbed the attic stairs. The familiar smell of old paper and cedar greeted me. I hadn't spent much time up there since Milton passed away. Some days it still hurt, but that morning felt different. I wasn't searching for memories. I was searching for answers. Several hours passed before I found what I was looking for. A large collection of photo albums, family reunions, vacations, birthdays, Christmas celebrations, nearly 50 years of family history. I carried the first album downstairs and opened it at the kitchen table. The reunion from 12 years earlier. There I was, standing beside Preston, laughing, one arm around Delaney, another photo. There I was helping set up picnic tables, another. There I was, sitting beside Yvonne. Both of us smiling. I stopped, looked closer, then looked again. Something felt strange. Not in the photograph itself, in my memory. I remembered that reunion. I remembered how different things had been. Yvonne had only been part of the family for a few years then. Back then, she often asked for my advice. Holiday recipes, parenting questions, family traditions. Sometimes she'd call just to chat. When had that stopped? I couldn't remember exactly, only that it had happened gradually, like water slowly wearing down stone, a little at a time, until the relationship became something entirely different. The realization followed me throughout the day. As I flipped through album after album, a pattern emerged. Not in the photographs, in the years themselves. The older pictures showed connection. The newer ones showed distance. At first, the changes were subtle. Then they became impossible to ignore. The more recent the photo, the farther from the center I seemed to be. Sometimes literally, standing on the edge of group pictures, seated at the end of tables, positioned slightly apart from everyone else. I wasn't sure if anyone else would notice, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. By late afternoon, my dining table was covered with albums. Photographs stretched across every available surface. I sat back in my chair, exhausted, thinking, trying to understand why. My phone suddenly buzzed, a text message. Delaney. "Grandma, are you home?" I smiled. Yes. Her reply came almost immediately. "Can I stop by?" Less than an hour later, she was sitting across from me at the kitchen table. The moment she saw the photograph spread everywhere, her eyes widened. Wow. I laughed softly. "Your grandfather never threw anything away." She picked up one of the albums. A genuine smile appeared on her face. I forgot this picture existed. It showed her at age 6 sitting on Milton's shoulders. The sight warmed both of us. For a few minutes, we simply looked through photographs together. No drama, no accusations, just memories. Then, Delaney's expression changed. She carefully closed the album in front of her. "Grandma." Something in her voice made me look up. "What is it?" She hesitated. The same way she had hesitated at the reunion. Like someone debating whether to reveal something important. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't tell you everything yesterday." My stomach tightened. I set down the photograph I was holding. "What didn't you tell me?" Delaney stared at the table for several seconds. Then she looked directly at me. "I heard Mom talking about you." A chill moved through me. Not because families never talk about each other, because I suddenly knew whatever came next wasn't going to be easy to hear. Delaney swallowed. She wasn't talking about photographs. I remained silent. She was talking about legacy. The word landed heavily between us. Legacy. Not decoration. Not photo walls. Not family displays. Legacy. And suddenly every missing photograph felt connected to something much larger. Something far more deliberate. Delaney looked uncomfortable, almost guilty, but she forced herself to continue. "What I heard that day," she said quietly. "It wasn't about removing pictures." She paused. then added the sentence that stayed with me long after she left. It sounded like Mom was trying to remove you from the family story itself. And at that moment, I realized the photographs had never been the real target. I was. Delaney's words stayed with me long after she left. It sounded like Mom was trying to remove you from the family story itself. The house felt unusually quiet that evening. Not lonely, not empty, just quiet. The kind of quiet that forces you to think. I sat alone at my dining room table, surrounded by decades of photographs. Stacks of albums, loose prints, holiday cards, family newsletters, scrapbooks, pieces of a life carefully preserved. Milton had always believed memories mattered, not because he was sentimental, because he understood how easily people forget. I remember teasing him about it once. It was years ago during a family vacation to the Smoky Mountains. He had stopped every few minutes to take another photograph. The cabin, the mountains, the children, the dogs, even breakfast. Finally, I laughed and asked him why he needed so many pictures. He smiled and gave me the same answer he always did. Because one day, somebody will want to remember. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Now I understood. The photographs weren't preserving faces. They were preserving truth. I looked down at a picture taken nearly 25 years earlier. Preston stood beside me at his first home. He had just signed the paperwork. The smile on his face stretched from ear to ear. I remembered that day clearly. Milton and I had spent months helping him save for the down payment. Not because he asked, because we wanted to. Parents do those things. You celebrate your children's successes as if they were your own. Sometimes more. The picture brought back another memory. The day he called after closing, his voice shaking with excitement. "Mom, I couldn't have done this without you and Dad." Back then, he meant it. I know he did. People don't fake gratitude that well. At least not when they're young. I stared at the photograph for several moments, then gently placed it aside. Another picture caught my attention. This one showed Yvonne holding baby Delaney. I remembered taking that photograph. Yvonne looked exhausted. New motherhood had been overwhelming. Milton and I spent countless weekends helping. Babysitting, cooking meals, running errands, doing whatever needed to be done. Not because we expected anything in return. Because family helps family. I found myself wondering if Yvonne remembered those years. The nights I drove over because Delaney had a fever. The afternoons I canceled plans because she needed help. The holidays spent cooking enough food for 20 people. The school pickups, the birthday parties, the graduations. The countless invisible acts that hold families together. Maybe she remembered. Maybe she didn't. Sometimes people become so focused on the present that they forget who helped build it. The thought saddened me. Not because I needed recognition, because gratitude and memory are closely connected. When one disappears, the other often follows. As darkness settled outside, I continued sorting through albums. One memory led to another, each photograph revealing a piece of the story. Not my story. Our story. The family's story. And the more I looked, the more obvious something became. I wasn't standing on the sidelines of these memories. I was woven through all of them. Every milestone, every celebration, every difficult season, every triumph, every loss. My presence wasn't occasional. It was foundational. That realization changed something inside me. Until now, I had been viewing the missing photographs as a personal attack, a rejection, a humiliation. But sitting there among decades of family history, I began seeing it differently. Removing me wasn't just unfair. It was impossible. Because too much of the family's history flowed through me. The traditions, the recipes, the holiday gatherings, the stories, the sacrifices, the relationships. You could remove a photograph. You could hide an album. But you couldn't erase the reality behind them. My eyes drifted toward a framed portrait hanging above the fireplace. Milton. The picture had been taken 2 years before his passing. His hair was grayer, his smile softer, yet his eyes looked exactly the same. Steady, confident, kind. For a moment, I simply stared at him, the way people sometimes do when they're searching for answers that can't be given. And unexpectedly, another memory surfaced. One I hadn't thought about in years. It happened shortly before he passed away. We were sitting on the back porch one evening, watching the sunset, talking about family. Milton had become unusually thoughtful. After a long silence, he said something strange. "Families don't fall apart all at once, Clarice." I remember looking at him. "What do you mean?" He smiled sadly. Most of the time, they drift apart one compromise at a time. At the time, I didn't fully understand. Now I did. Because looking back, I could see every compromise. Every moment I chose peace over confrontation. Every time I ignored a slight. Every time I convinced myself something wasn't worth addressing. The distance hadn't appeared overnight. It had accumulated slowly, year after year, until eventually, I found myself standing in a family room where my face had been removed from every wall. My phone buzzed. A text message. Patricia. Short and simple. Call me tomorrow morning. I found something. I stared at the message. My heartbeat quickened. Patricia wasn't the type to exaggerate. If she said she'd found something, she meant it. For the first time since the reunion, a different feeling emerged. Not sadness, not confusion, expectation. Because pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to connect. The photographs, the storage boxes, the conversations Delaney overheard, the growing distance over the years. None of it was random. None of it was accidental. There was a reason behind all of it. A reason someone had worked so hard to reshape the family's history. As I gathered the albums and carefully returned them to their boxes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting closer to the truth. And deep down, I knew something else. Whatever Patricia had discovered, it was going to explain far more than a missing photograph wall. The next morning, I called Patricia before I even finished my coffee. The moment she answered, I knew something had changed. Patricia wasn't a dramatic person. She didn't exaggerate, she didn't gossip, and she certainly didn't call people first thing in the morning unless she believed something mattered. "Good morning," I said. "Morning." Her voice sounded unusually serious. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she got straight to the point. "I went back to Preston's house yesterday." My grip tightened around the coffee mug. "You did?" "Yes." Patricia paused. "I wanted to see those storage boxes." A chill moved through me. Immediately, I remembered what she had mentioned at the reunion. The boxes hidden in the garage. The photographs that had supposedly been removed. "What did you find?" Another pause. Then she sighed. "More than photographs." I sat down slowly. "What does that mean?" Patricia lowered her voice. "I found family albums." I closed my eyes. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Family albums. Not just framed pictures. Albums. Entire collections of family memories. How many? Several. The word hit harder than I expected. Several. Not one, not two. Several. Years of memories. Years of family history. Packed away in cardboard boxes. Hidden from view. I stared out my kitchen window. The morning sun illuminated the backyard Milton and I had once cared for together. For a moment, I imagined him standing there, hands in his pockets, watching quietly, waiting for me to figure things out. "What else?" I asked. Patricia exhaled slowly. There was something attached to one of the boxes. My pulse quickened. A label. I waited. Patricia's voice softened. It said, "Old family photos." The words landed heavily. Old family photos. Not family photos. Old family photos. As though they were outdated. As though they no longer belonged. As though they were something to be replaced. I felt sadness more than anger. Because memories aren't old. They're either cherished or forgotten. And someone had clearly decided which category mine belonged in. "What happened after that?" I asked. I confronted Yvonne. That surprised me. Patricia rarely backed down from anything. But even so, I hadn't expected direct confrontation. "What did she say?" Patricia laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because the answer still bothered her. She said she was simplifying things. Simplifying, updating, fresh start. The phrases kept changing. The meaning never did. I thanked Patricia for telling me. Then we ended the call. But I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Family albums. Entire albums hidden away. That afternoon, I drove to the local diner where Delaney worked part-time. She joined me during her break. The moment she sat down, she could tell something was on my mind. What happened? I told her everything. Patricia. The garage. The albums. The labels. The conversation. Delaney listened quietly. When I finished, she stared at the table. Then she said something that made my heart ache. I knew it. I looked up. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "A few months ago, Mom started making a digital family archive. A digital family archive. The phrase immediately caught my attention. What kind of archive? Photos. My stomach tightened. Family videos. Tighter. Slideshows. I remained silent. Then Delaney added the part that changed everything. She was rebuilding the family history. Those words echoed inside my mind. Rebuilding. Not preserving. Not organizing. Rebuilding. As though the original version wasn't good enough. As though someone had decided the story needed a different author. What was different about it? I asked carefully. Delaney hesitated, then she answered. Certain people appeared more often. I already knew where this was going. And certain people appeared less. She nodded. The silence between us stretched. Neither of us needed to say my name. We both understood. For years, I had assumed the photographs were the issue. The reunion wall, the missing frames, the altered displays. Now I finally understood. Those things were merely symptoms. The real project had been happening somewhere else. A new version of family history was being created. A version where some people became central, and others slowly faded away. I drove home afterward with a strange sense of clarity. Not peace. Not yet. But clarity. For days, I had been asking myself the wrong question. Why were the photographs removed? That wasn't the important question. The important question was, why was someone working so hard to replace them? That evening, I sat in my living room surrounded by albums once again. One photograph after another rested across the coffee table. Milton holding newborn Delaney. Preston building a treehouse. Christmas mornings. Graduations. Family reunions. Half a century of memories. I looked carefully at every face. Every smile. Every moment. And suddenly I realized something beautiful. Something no photograph wall could ever change. I wasn't important because my picture appeared in a frame. I was important because I had been there. I had lived those moments. I had helped create them. No one could rewrite that truth. No one could erase it. Not from the people who remembered. Not from the people who loved me. And certainly not from me. I picked up one photograph in particular, a reunion picture taken nearly 20 years earlier. Milton stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders. The entire family gathered behind us. I smiled softly. For the first time since the reunion, the sadness began to ease. Because I finally understood something. The people who try hardest to rewrite history are usually fighting a battle they've already lost. Truth has a way of surviving. Memories have a way of resurfacing. And family stories belong to everyone who lived them, not just the person trying to control them. As the evening sun filtered through the living room windows, I carefully returned the photographs to their albums, one by one, not hidden, not erased, preserved, exactly as they were meant to be. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the life Milton and I had built together, I realized that no one, not even Yvonne, had the power to remove me from the family's story. Because I was never just a picture on a wall, I was part of the foundation, and foundations remain long after the decorations change. For a while, I thought the missing photographs were the real loss. They weren't. The real loss belonged to the people who forgot the hands that helped build their lives. As for me, I still have my memories, my dignity, and the truth. And after 70 years, I've learned those things are worth far more than a place on any wall.